The fluorescent lights at Mercy General buzzed like cicadas trapped in the walls, a sound that never stopped, a sound that made time feel liquid and strange. Megan O'Brien had been listening to that sound for 3 years, 3 years of night shifts, of invisible hands, of a face that nobody remembered 5 minutes after she left a room. That was precisely the point. She moved through the ICU corridors at 0530 with the kind of efficiency that looked like ordinary nursing to everyone watching but was actually muscle memory written by a decade of field hospitals in Helmand Province. Her scrubs were navy blue, regulation issue, and her hair was pulled back so tightly it erased any chance of personality. Long sleeves, even in summer. Even when the ICU temperature climbed to 82 degrees and the other nurses complained. Nobody asked why. That was the second thing she'd learned about invisibility. Nobody asked questions about the quiet ones. Her left leg favored itself slightly when she moved between beds, not a limp exactly, more like a preference, the way a guitar player favors one hand. A 7.62mm round had passed through the anterior compartment of her tibia in 2015, and the surgeons at Walter Reed had done exceptional work, but her body remembered what her mouth never spoke. When the ambulance sirens wailed at night, she would freeze mid-charting for exactly 3 seconds, her hands going completely still above the keyboard, and then she would force them to move again with the kind of deliberate control that takes practice. Years of practice. Her locker on the 3rd floor contained 3 things besides her street clothes: a photograph of her son in navy whites, face down so she wouldn't have to see it, a set of dog tags wrapped in medical tape, wrapped so carefully they never made a sound, and a pair of worn combat boots sealed in a plastic grocery bag from 2014, the plastic yellowed and brittle now, the boots inside so broken in they had mold to the shape of feet that belonged to someone else. Someone from before. Megan opened that locker maybe twice a month, and she never touched the bag. Night shift going okay? This was from Jennifer, one of the younger nurses, the kind who had student loan debt and wedding Pinterest boards and the unself-conscious brightness of people who had never held a soldier while he died in the rain. Megan nodded without looking up from the charting station. Jennifer waited maybe 3 seconds for more conversation, then drifted toward the break room where the others were probably comparing notes about their weekends. They didn't invite Megan. Not anymore. They had tried once, 6 months into her employment, and her response, "I'm not really a social person," had been delivered in a voice so flat it discouraged all future attempts. The ICU charge nurse, a woman named Holloway who had actually seen some world and therefore understood the value of not asking questions, caught Megan's eye from across the station. Just a glance. Recognition. The kind of nod that exists between people who have been broken and fixed and broken again. Holloway had been Army Reserve, medic, until her knee gave out in a training accident. She didn't talk about it. She didn't need to. Megan respected the hell out of that. At 0547, the admission board lit up with a red alert. ER to ICU transfer, incoming by ambulance from Norfolk International Airport. The kind of alert that meant something catastrophic was already in progress. Megan's eyes moved to the details scrolling across the screen: military transport from Germany, cardiac involvement, shrapnel location listed as proximal to left anterior descending and right atrium with pericardial involvement. Which meant a piece of metal was sitting next to a man's heart like a timing bomb with no countdown timer. The ER had called 45 seconds before the patient actually arrived, just long enough for the ICU to pull the trauma bay open and plug in the extra monitors and position the crash cart where hands could reach it without wasting motion. Megan was already moving toward Bay 3 when she heard the sirens cut out. Ambulance doors slamming. Radio chatter bleeding into the hospital's own frequency: 42-year-old male, blast injury, shrapnel fragments throughout thoracic cavity, presenting with stable vitals but cardiology is concerned about pericardial effusion. Patient is Navy, rank lieutenant commander, wife accompanying, ETA 30 seconds. The stretcher came through the ER doors moving at the speed of controlled crisis, not running, because running means panic, but not walking either. The patient was a man with the kind of grey in his beard that comes from deployments and decisions made at 0300 hours, and his wife was beside the stretcher with one hand on his shoulder and her entire face structured around the effort of not falling apart. Megan had seen that expression 400 times. Maybe more. It was the face of someone who had gotten the phone call that started with "There's been an incident," and everything after that was just waiting to find out if her husband would remember her name when this was over. She recognized him. That was the problem. That was the thing that made her hands actually shake for a fraction of a second before she locked it down. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes. Her son's commanding officer. The man who had written the letter, the one that started with "I regret to inform you that your son was killed in action," but who had also personally called her 3 weeks later and said, "He went out the way he would have wanted to. He was thinking about getting back to you. I made sure of that." Marcus Hayes, who had brought her son home in a flag-draped coffin and stood at the grave service in his dress uniform looking like he was personally holding up the sky with his shoulders. Marcus Hayes, who was now bleeding into his pericardium from shrapnel that had no business being anywhere near an American hospital. Megan moved into the trauma bay with her hands steady and her face empty and her voice as neutral as the antiseptic-scented air. "Bay 3 is ready. How long was transport time?" She was talking to the flight medic, not making eye contact with Hayes or his wife or the man's terrified expression when he saw the ICU setup. That was professional. That was invisible. 14 hours, the medic was saying, from Ramstein to here, stable the whole way, but cardiology at Landstuhl flagged the shrapnel location and insisted on transport to a level 1 trauma facility. Wife says he's refusing sedation because he's a stubborn son of a bitch, and I quote. Hayes tried to laugh and then didn't, because laughing moved his chest, and moving his chest was apparently a bad decision at this particular moment in history. The ICU nurses got him transferred onto the hospital bed with a kind of synchronized motion that comes from practice. Megan was attaching monitors, reading vitals, already knowing what the EKG was going to show because she could read a patient's status in the way they breathed and held their shoulders and whether their eyes could focus. Hayes's wife stood against the far wall trying to be invisible, and Megan understood that impulse with a clarity that surprised her. You stand in the corner. You don't take up space. You don't ask questions. You let other people make decisions about the person you love most in the world. O2 sat. Holloway was asking. 96 on room air, Megan reported. Heart rate 88, BP 134/76, no arrhythmias on the monitor, but the pericardial effusion is probably limiting his cardiac output more than the vitals are reflecting. Which meant that in about 6 to 12 hours, he might go into cardiac tamponade. Which meant that his heart would stop filling with blood, and his blood pressure would collapse, and he would arrest, and nobody would be able to restart him because there would be no room for his heart to beat. Simple physics. Terrible physics. At 0623, Dr. Sterling arrived for morning rounds. He moved through the ICU like he was conducting an inspection of property he owned, his white coat perfectly pressed, his stethoscope positioned around his neck with the kind of symmetry that suggested he adjusted it in mirrors throughout the day. Behind him came his entourage, 3 residents who dressed like him, 2 medical students who looked confused about what they were doing there, and a nursing student who was probably just trying to graduate. Dr. Sterling was 58 years old and had been chief of surgery at Mercy General for 11 years, and his department's surgical mortality rate was the lowest in the hospital system, which was impressive until he realized it was impressive because he never took the hard cases. He was the kind of physician who understood that statistics were written in blood and that the easiest way to keep your statistics clean was to make sure the blood belonged to someone else's patient. He stopped at the nurse's station, and without looking at any particular nurse, he announced, "Who took the Hayes admission?" "I did," Megan said. She handed him the chart. She had the charting done before he even asked because that was what invisible people did, they anticipated. 42-year-old male, military transfer from Germany, blast injury with shrapnel fragments in thoracic cavity. Pericardial effusion noted on imaging. Current vital stable but cardiology is concerned about progression to tamponade. Sterling glanced at the chart the way someone glances at a restaurant menu they've already decided against. Shrapnel proximity. 0.5 centimeters from the LAD, Megan said. And adjacent to the right atrium. The entire ICU went very quiet. That was the moment when everyone understood that Dr. Sterling was about to say something that was going to change the shape of the next 72 hours, and nobody was going to like it. That's inoperable, Sterling said flatly. The surgical risk is catastrophic. Any attempt to access that shrapnel has a 93% complication rate, and we're talking about complications that include myocardial infarction, hemorrhage, arrhythmia, sudden cardiac death. This is a do not attempt resuscitation situation waiting to happen. Megan kept her hands on the desk. She kept her breathing even. The part of her that had been a senior chief petty officer, the part that had trained combat medics and made decisions under fire and held people together with her actual hands, that part stayed silent. That part didn't exist. That part was locked in the plastic bag in her locker with the boots. The family is requesting surgical consultation, Holloway said quietly. Then I'll consult, Sterling said. He turned and walked away, his entourage following like pilot fish. But before he reached the corner, he turned back and called to Megan without making eye contact, "Keep him stable. We're not operating on impossible cases just because someone's wife is crying." By 1100, Sterling had made 12 phone calls. Megan knew this because she heard him in his office with the door closed, but his voice carrying the way voices do when a man is accustomed to being heard. He called the head of cardiothoracic surgery. He called the department chair. He called the hospital's risk management director twice. And by 11:15, he had scheduled an emergency surgical consultation for 1400. What he had not done was schedule an operating room. At 13:47, Hayes's wife, Sarah, was standing beside her husband's bed in the ICU looking at the collection of monitors and tubes with the expression of someone watching a mathematical equation she didn't understand but was fairly certain meant her husband was going to die. Megan was charting vitals, moving through her work with the kind of mechanical precision that allowed her to be invisible and helpful simultaneously. She had long ago learned that in hospitals, the people who were truly indispensable were the ones nobody noticed. The surgical consultation started in the conference room adjacent to the ICU, and Sterling made sure it was visible through the glass partition. Made sure the doors were positioned so voices would carry. Made sure that Sarah could see 10 men in white coats sitting around a table, all of them shaking their heads. 10 doctors. That was how many showed up when Dr. Sterling made calls. That was how many senior physicians told their residents what Sterling had told them. This case is too risky, this case will destroy your mortality statistics, this case will tank your career trajectory, this case is not worth fighting for. One of them was Dr. Marcus Webb, the youngest cardiologist on staff, and he sat through the first 7 minutes of the consultation before he said, "The risk is significant, yes, but the patient will almost certainly develop tamponade within 72 hours. Without intervention, he's looking at sudden death. With intervention, he has a chance. A 0.07% chance, another doctor said. That was Dr. Caldwell, the head of cardiothoracic surgery. He had trained Sterling 15 years earlier. We're not using chance as a justification for operating. We use risk-benefit analysis, and the risk far exceeds the benefit. Sterling didn't argue. He didn't need to. He just let the weight of 10 physicians disagreeing with the idea of surgery hang in the air like humidity. He let 10 men in white coats communicate, without a single one of them saying it directly, that Lieutenant Commander Hayes was already dead, he just didn't know it yet, and if any of them touched a scalpel, they were simply hastening the inevitable while destroying their own credibility in the process. By 14:30, the consultation was over. Sterling walked through the ICU and made eye contact with Sarah for the first time, and his voice was as gentle as a knife. "We've decided that given the complexity and risk, surgery would not be advisable at this time. Your husband is stable, and we'll continue to monitor his condition. We've discussed comfort care options with our palliative team, and they can be available if you'd like to discuss transition of care. Which was doctor speak for, we have decided your husband will die, and we're giving you permission to make peace with that." Sarah's hands gripped the bedrail. Her knuckles turned white. She looked at her husband, and then she looked at Megan, the only person in the room who wasn't delivering a death sentence, and her eyes asked a question that had no answer. Megan's hands were steady. Megan's face was empty. Megan's voice, when she spoke, was the voice of someone who had seen worse and lived to speak about it, even though nobody in that room yet understood that. "He's stable right now," Megan said quietly. "We monitor vitals every 30 minutes. The pericardial effusion is being tracked on serial echocardiograms. If his condition changes, we'll respond immediately." It wasn't a promise that he would survive. It was a promise that she would notice. That she would stay. That in a room full of people who had already written off a Navy SEAL as a statistical liability, there was at least one person who understood that statistics were written by the living, and the living hadn't finished their story yet. Sterling left the ICU at 14:45. His entourage followed. The 10 doctors dispersed back to their departments and their perfectly managed mortality rates and their carefully curated surgical statistics. And in Bay 3, while monitors beeped their mechanical rhythm and the afternoon light moved across the walls in slabs of gold, Megan O'Brien began her vigil. The afternoon light slanted across Bay 3 in slabs of gold, and Megan O'Brien stood at the foot of Lieutenant Commander Hayes's bed, reading his chart as if the numbers on the page might tell her something the 10 doctors had already decided. His wife sat in the vinyl chair beside him, one hand gripping his, the other pressed against her mouth. Megan had seen that posture before, in field hospitals in Helmand Province, in the faces of women who understood their husbands might not wake up. Hayes's vitals were holding. For now. Blood pressure 118/72. Heart rate 84. The chest X-ray clip to the lightboard showed what they all knew: shrapnel fragments suspended like dark needles 2 millimeters from the pericardium, the sac surrounding his heart. Surgery within 48 hours, the radiologist's report said. After that, the margins disappeared. Megan had reviewed the imaging herself at 1,400 hours. She'd seen combat casualties with shrapnel patterns like this. She knew the anatomy. She knew what happened when the pericardium filled with blood. But knowing something and being permitted to speak it were two different things in a hospital where 10 doctors had already walked away. The intercom crackled overhead. "Dr. Sterling to ICU conference room. Dr. Sterling to ICU conference room." She watched him enter through the glass wall 20 minutes later, moving with the fluid certainty of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. 10 doctors crowded the conference table: Dr. Chen from cardiothoracic, Dr. Patel from general surgery, Dr. Rodriguez from trauma, and 7 others whose names Megan had memorized the way soldiers memorized exit routes. All of them reviewing the same imaging. All of them listening to Sterling close the file with a sound like a door locking. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had never been told no. "This is a statistics nightmare. The shrapnel placement makes bypass mandatory. The patient's prognosis sits at 40% even with intervention. Mercy General doesn't take these cases. Our mortality rates are competitive. I'd prefer they remain that way." One by one, they agreed. Dr. Chen cited liability concerns. Dr. Patel mentioned malpractice premiums climbing. Dr. Rodriguez shook his head about the risks, the paperwork, the months of depositions if something went wrong. They filed out like pallbearers, and Megan watched from the nurse's station as Sterling remained in the conference room, reviewing something on his tablet, the faint smile of a man who had just eliminated a problem without ever raising his voice. At 1,530 hours, Megan approached him outside Hayes's room. His wife was still sitting vigil, and the monitors beat their steady rhythm, and Megan's hands were steady because she had spent 18 years making her hands steady. "Dr. Sterling," she said. "I've seen this injury pattern before. Shrapnel at that proximity to the pericardium. He needs surgery within 48 hours or the inflammation will." "This nurse," Sterling said, his voice loud enough that residents 3 bays over froze mid-step, "seems to think her community college degree trumps a decade of surgical experience." He turned to face her fully, and his eyes held the particular coldness of someone unused to interruption. "Ms. O'Brien, when you finish your online courses, perhaps you can explain to Mrs. Hayes here why her husband's death wouldn't be your fault." Hayes's wife stared at Megan with desperate, confused eyes. 2 nurses covered their mouths. The monitors kept beeping. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric lullaby. And Megan O'Brien took one measured breath, the kind of breath you take before breaching a compound, before moving through a kill zone, before accepting that the world had just divided itself into those who would help and those who would watch. A single tear fell. She let it fall. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had held lives together in places where hospitals were tents and antibiotics were currency. "Liability concerns are valid, Doctor," she said. "But so is the oath we took." Sterling's smile flickered. He turned and walked away, his loafers clicking against the tile floor like a metronome counting down the hours. The break room at 1600 hours was a study in small cruelties. Megan sat at a corner table with her lunch, a sandwich she wasn't hungry for, coffee that had gone tepid, and watched for nurses gather at the center table. They were young, new to the ICU, still learning whose favor mattered and whose didn't. They gathered their bags without a word and left, their chairs scraping against the floor as if the sound alone could communicate what their mouths wouldn't. The room emptied around her like water draining from a basin. At 1700 hours, Megan checked the unit disciplinary board posted in the supervisor's office. Her name was written there in red marker, underlined twice, O'Brien, written up for inappropriate challenges to physician authority, see supervisor. The word sat beneath 3 other write-ups, one of which had been placed there by Sterling himself. Sterling stood at the nurse's station 20 feet away, watching her read it. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The smirk was there in the way he held his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked her, the way he turned back to his computer with the satisfied expression of someone who had just moved a piece across a board. Megan returned to Hayes's bedside. His wife had fallen asleep in the vinyl chair, her head tilted back, her hand still gripping his. The monitors continued their rhythm, beep, beep, beep. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath. Outside, the Norfolk afternoon was sliding into evening, and somewhere in the hospital, 10 doctors were reviewing their surgical schedules, their mortality statistics, their carefully maintained professional reputations. She had been through worse. She had been in places where the only light came from muzzle flashes and the only sound was screaming. She had held arterial bleeds closed with her bare hands in combat hospitals where antibiotics ran out on Tuesday and you did what you could with what remained. She had watched people die because there were no resources, no doctors, no miracles available at any price. But this was different. This wasn't a circumstance. This was a choice. 10 doctors had looked at a man and decided his life was worth less than their statistics. That night, alone in her apartment, a studio in a neighborhood where rent was cheap and neighbors didn't ask questions, Megan sat on her bed and stared at the pair of worn combat boots in her closet. They were Dana's, sand-colored, creased from 1,000 kilometers of foot patrols in Helmand province. The heels were scuffed. The leather was cracked. She had carried them out of that country 19 months after her medical discharge, and they had remained in her closet ever since, a talisman no one was meant to find. She didn't look at them often. When she did, she felt the weight of 3 tours, 847 combat casualties treated, 2 Bronze Stars, citations that existed in classified files she had never been permitted to see. She felt the weight of being Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien in a world that only knew her as Megan the nurse from Norfolk with mysterious employment gaps and a community college degree. She put the boots back in the closet and closed the door. At 2,300 hours on her next shift, Megan monitored Hayes through the evening hours as his vitals began their slow decline. Blood pressure dropped from 118 to 110. Then 105. Heart rate climbed from 84 to 98 to 112. Jugular veins began to distend, the vein in his neck rising like a road map drawn in desperation. His wife woke every hour and asked, "Why won't they operate? Why isn't anyone doing anything?" And Megan had no answer that didn't implicate the 10 doctors, didn't expose Sterling's choice, didn't transform this room into a crime scene defined by omission rather than action. At 01 for 5 hours, the monitor alarm sounded. Blood pressure 78/42 and dropping. Heart rate 134. Muffled heart sounds, the classic triad of cardiac tamponade, the pericardium filling with blood, compressing the heart like a fist closing around a bird. Megan paged the on-call surgeon. Dr. Miller answered on the fourth ring, his voice thick with the confusion of someone pulled from sleep. "What's the patient's code status?" he asked. "Full code, doctor. He needs emergency drainage. Cardiac tamponade, his." Dr. Sterling refused this case, Miller said. His voice carried the tone of a man reading from a script he'd already memorized. "I'm not touching it. Call him." Sterling didn't answer his phone. But that wasn't the worst part. The evening shift had changed nothing except the numbers on the monitor, and Megan watched them with the kind of attention that comes from recognizing the countdown. Hayes's blood pressure had drifted from 110/70 at 6 o'clock to 95/60 by 9, the systolic climbing downward like a meter running in reverse. His heart rate had climbed to 115, a rhythm of panic his body was screaming before his brain could even process it. The jugular veins in his neck distended with each labored breath, the classic sign that blood was pooling where it had no business pooling, pressing against the chambers of his heart like water behind a dam getting ready to burst. Megan had seen this before. Not in a textbook. In the field. In a trauma bay in Helmand Province where a Marine from 1st Battalion, 5th Marines had presented with identical symptoms after an IED took out his Humvee, and she'd had exactly 4 minutes to fix it or watch him die. The muscle memory didn't fade. The hands remembered. The eyes still read the signs. She stood at his bedside for the 9:13 p.m. vitals check, her finger steady on Hayes's wrist, counting the pulse against the watch clipped to her scrubs. The latex glove made a soft whisper against his skin. 118 beats per minute. Too fast. Too desperate. His wife sat in the visitor's chair with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white, watching every move Megan made as if her attention alone could keep her husband's heart beating. "His pressure is dropping," Megan said quietly. Not alarming. Not panicked. Just fact. "I need to notify the surgical team." The charge nurse, Rebecca, appeared in the doorway like someone had called her name. She was good people, the kind of nurse who didn't walk away during humiliation and hadn't been in the break room this afternoon. "What do you need?" she asked, already moving toward the phone. "The attending surgeon. And get me the crash cart prepped in the corner." Megan's voice had dropped an octave without her noticing. "But first, page Dr. Sterling and tell him Hayes is showing signs of tamponade." The phone call came back within 7 minutes. Dr. Sterling would not be coming to the ICU. He was not on hospital property. He had left instructions that Hayes was a non-surgical case and to manage his care medically, meaning oxygen, meaning observation, meaning the slow slide toward the inevitable. The message was delivered by the night operator with apologies in her voice, which meant somewhere in the hospital, people already knew this patient was being allowed to die on a spreadsheet. 3 other doctors refused when the charge nurse paged them. One was already asleep. Another said it was outside his specialty. A third, Dr. Carlisle, actually picked up and said, "I saw his chart. The liability exposure is too high. Sterling's right." That made 10. Megan did the math without trying to. 10 doctors at Mercy General, and 10 doctors had decided that keeping Hayes alive was worth less than protecting their own clinical statistics. At 11:34 p.m., Hayes's color began to shift. The oxygen was getting in, the monitor showed saturation at 96%, but something was preventing his body from using it. His lips took on a faint blue tint, cyanotic, the color of someone drowning in a room full of air. His wife stood up from the chair. Her breathing changed. She saw it too. "Honey," she whispered. "Baby, stay with me." Hayes's eyes rolled slightly, confusion crossing his features. The pressure building against his heart was making it harder to think, harder to stay conscious. Blood pressure now 88/52. Heart rate at 127 and climbing. The oxygen saturation that had seemed stable dropped to 87%. Then 84. Then 82. His wife screamed. The sound, that particular frequency of absolute panic that only a woman watching her husband die can make, cut through the ICU like a scalpel. It brought nurses running. It brought the night charge nurse Rebecca sprinting back into the room, and Megan was already moving, already pulling the crash cart with its defibrillator and emergency medications and all the things that worked for every problem except the one killing Lieutenant Commander Hayes right now. Because CPR wouldn't fix this. The defibrillator wouldn't fix this. Every medication in this cart would be pushing blood into a heart that had no room left to receive it, trying to fill a chamber that was already drowning in its own fluid. Cardiac tamponade didn't wait. Cardiac tamponade killed fast, killed quiet, killed with the patient's own blood as the weapon. Megan was already opening the procedure tray, hands moving with the precision that came from having done this once before, in a field hospital with incoming fire and contaminated instruments and absolutely no choice. She pulled the 18-gauge spinal needle from the kit, 6 inches long, sterile, designed to go between ribs and into the sac around the heart. The needle caught the light as she held it up to verify the gauge. The metal was cool against her fingertips. "I'm calling the attending," Rebecca said, phone already in her hand. "I'm calling." "Already done," Megan said. Her voice had become something different, not higher, not lower, just absent of any question mark. Not a request anymore. A statement of fact. 3 pages. "He's not coming. Get me a witness's log started and chart everything I do. If anyone asks, I called for physician approval first. You witness that." The needle was poised, ready. Megan's mind had already mapped the anatomy, 5th intercostal space, just left of the sternum, the landmark that separated a life-saving intervention from a catastrophic mistake. The space between 2 ribs where a needle 6 inches long could reach the pericardial sac without puncturing the lung or the heart itself. She'd done this exactly once before, in a place where medicine was practiced with whatever you had on hand and the only consent form was desperation. The betadine bottle was in her other hand, the distinctive orange-brown that smelled like iodine and concentrated survival. She prepped Hayes's chest, the antiseptic cold against his skin, her motions economical and sure. The trembling wasn't in her hands. The trembling was in the room, in the wife's breathing, in Hayes's failing oxygenation, in the monitor's escalating rhythm of distress. And then the door to the ICU room opened. Dr. Sterling stood in the threshold, still in street clothes, a charcoal blazer and a tie that probably cost more than Megan made in a week. His presence had that particular gravity of a man who had never been told no in his entire career, who arranged the world according to his preferences and assumed it would stay arranged. He saw the needle in her hand. He saw the prep on Hayes's chest. He saw what was about to happen. His face went pale. "O'Brien," he said, and his voice had the quality of cold water poured over glass. "If you do that procedure, you are finished. That is a physician-only intervention. I will have your nursing license revoked. I will personally ensure you never work in this state again." He wasn't yelling. That was the worst part about it. He was calm, certain, the voice of a man whose threats had always worked before because he wielded them like currency and everyone around him always cashed them immediately. Megan positioned the needle at a 45-degree angle, pointing toward Hayes's left shoulder. One measured breath. The kind of breath you take before you burn the bridge you've been standing on your entire career. The kind of breath you take when you've already survived the worst things a human being can experience and someone's hollow threats feel like air. One tear escaped her eye. She felt it fall, warm against her cheek in the cold air-conditioned ICU. She wiped it away without looking away from Sterling's face, and when she spoke, her voice was lower than the hum of the ventilator, steadier than the declining heartbeat. "Then you better call security, doctor," she said. "Because he'll be dead in 3 minutes if I don't." The needle advanced. She felt the subtle resistance as it passed between the ribs, felt the slight pop as it breached the pericardial membrane, the distinctive give of tissue giving way to steel. And then the syringe in her other hand, she pulled the plunger back and blood filled the chamber. Dark red. Fresh. 200 cubic centimeters of blood that had been compressing Hayes's heart, blood that should have been inside his vessels instead of outside, instead of stopping him from living. The syringe filled. Then emptied. Then filled again. Blood pressure climbing, Rebecca called out, reading the monitor. 95/60. 100/62. 110/70. Hayes's color returned. Not all at once, but the cyanosis that had painted his lips blue faded to normal pink. His oxygen saturation climbed, 84%, 88%, 92%, 96% again. The heart rate that had been climbing toward a rest began to steady. The rhythm on the monitor shifted from the jagged panic back to something recognizable, something that could sustain life. His wife was sobbing into her hands, but these were different sobs. Relief sobs. Gratitude sobs. The sobs of someone who had watched the door to death close just before it locked. Sterling pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. His fingers moved with the deliberate precision of someone executing a plan that had been in his back pocket all along, waiting for exactly this moment. "Security to ICU," he said into the phone, his voice level as ice. "Now. I need an escort for an employee who is in violation of hospital policy." Megan withdrew the needle, disposed of it in the sharps container, and stepped back from Hayes's bedside. She looked at the blood-filled syringe on the tray beside her. She looked at Lieutenant Commander Hayes, whose eyes were already becoming more focused, whose wife was reaching for his hand. She looked at Dr. Sterling, whose face had flushed now with something that might have been rage or might have been the beginning of understanding that his power had just collided with something he didn't know how to measure. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath. The ICU, the place that had smelled like antiseptic and fear just 30 seconds ago, now smelled like survival, like the sharp metallic tang that came after procedures that shouldn't have worked but did. But that wasn't the real reckoning coming. 2 security guards stood outside Hayes's room at 0230, their presence less protection than surveillance. Megan finished the bolus run, 1,000 milliliters of normal saline through the 18-gauge line in his right arm, checking his vitals every 5 minutes with the precision of someone who had done this exact thing in field hospitals where the electricity came from generators and the surgical light was a headlamp. Blood pressure 118/76. Heart rate steady. O2 saturation climbing back to normal. The ICU had gone quiet around her, that particular silence of the night shift where monitors hummed their mechanical lullaby and the world outside the windows had surrendered to darkness. Hayes's wife had finally fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still gripping his wrist as if letting go would undo everything Megan had just fixed. When the charge nurse appeared with the incident report, Megan filled it out in medical language so precise it bordered on defiant. Emergency pericardiocentesis performed at 2,247 hours using 25-gauge spinal needle at the 5th intercostal space, subxiphoid approach. 200 cubic centimeters of sanguineous fluid evacuated from pericardial sac. Sinus rhythm restored. She signed it. Dated it. The charge nurse, an older woman named Patricia who'd been at Mercy General for 19 years, read it once, then looked at Megan with an expression that mixed gratitude and fear in equal measure. "You saved him," Patricia said quietly. Megan didn't answer. She was already thinking about what came next. What always came next when you stepped outside the lines. Hayes's wife woke at 05:05 and found Megan checking the cardiac monitor one last time before the morning shift rotation. The woman's eyes were red from crying, but something had shifted in them, the clarity that comes from watching someone pull your world back from the edge of a cliff. "Why would they fire you?" she asked. "For saving his life." Megan had no answer. She arranged the monitor leads with careful precision, her hands moving through the muscle memory of 10,000 shifts, and said nothing because sometimes silence is more honest than words. At 0600, Dr. Sterling returned. He didn't come alone. The hospital administrator walked beside him, a man named David Chen whose corner office overlooked the parking lot, and behind them came the director of human resources, a woman with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she'd done this before. Sterling was smiling. Not the thin, professional smile he wore during rounds, a real smile, the kind that comes when a plan has executed exactly as intended. He'd made calls, Megan could see it in the satisfied set of his shoulders, in the way he didn't even glance at Hayes's room as they passed. He knew his work was already complete. They brought her to the supervisor's office on the 3rd floor, a space with grey walls and grey carpet and a fluorescent light that made everyone look like they were dying. The termination letter was already printed, sitting on the desk like a piece of evidence in a crime scene. Megan read it once while Sterling watched from the corner of the room, his arms crossed like he was standing in a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Performing procedures outside scope of practice, it read. Repeated insubordination. Creating a hostile work environment by challenging physician authority. Effective immediately. 20 minutes to clear your locker, Chen said, not unkindly. Security will escort you. They walked through the hospital like a funeral procession. Megan in the middle, 2 security officers flanking her the way they would a person who'd stolen something. She knew what the nurses thought as she passed their stations, that she'd overstepped, that she'd broken the sacred hierarchy that kept hospitals functioning, that she'd embarrassed the department and paid the price for it. None of them understood that saying the word no to a dying man is the same as choosing his death. The locker room was cold. Institutional. Her locker was 3rd from the left, painted pale green like every other one. She opened it slowly. The combat boots were there on the top shelf, wrapped in plastic to keep the dust off. She'd kept them for 9 years. Through 3 moves. Through 2 jobs. Through the entire journey from Helmand to Norfolk to this moment, standing in a locker room that smelled like disinfectant and failure. She reached for them. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from the specific kind of rage that comes from knowing you did the right thing and are being destroyed for it anyway. She pulled her hand back. Left the boots there. Her jacket. Her phone charger. Her spare stethoscope. The things that belonged to her, not the things that defined her. She carried them in her hands and watched as the security officer opened the plastic bag and began sweeping the rest of the locker's contents into it. The boots went in last, wrapped in plastic and destined for the trash. She turned away before she could see them disappear. The ICU was different when you were leaving it. The fluorescent light seemed harsher. The monitors sounded more like warnings than reassurances. Nurses wouldn't meet her eyes as she walked past, which meant they'd already heard. The gossip had crystallized into narrative. She'd overstepped. She'd performed a procedure that wasn't her job. She'd challenged a doctor and lost. Case closed. No one asked why 10 doctors had refused to save a man's life. No one asked why it had taken a nurse to do what surgeons were trained to do. They just accepted the outcome the way they accepted every other hierarchy, every other rule written by people who'd never had to watch someone die because they couldn't save them. Hayes's wife was standing at the window of his room, watching through the glass. She saw Megan walk past and her mouth opened, a question forming, confusion crossing her face like a cloud. Megan couldn't stop. Couldn't explain. Couldn't do anything but keep moving toward the exit. Dr. Sterling stood at the nurse's station as she approached. He'd timed it perfectly. He smiled at her the way a predator smiles at prey that's already been wounded. Ms. O'Brien, you'll be hearing from the State Nursing Board, he said, his voice pitched for maximum carry. Every nurse in the unit heard it. I filed a formal complaint regarding your licensing. My legal team has been notified. We'll see if they reach the same conclusions I have about your professional judgment. Megan stopped walking. She turned to face him completely. Her jaw clenched once, then released. She let one breath escape, just one, and then she said, I did my job, doctor. Your job is to follow orders, he said. Not to override physician judgment. My job, she said, her voice dropping half an octave, is to keep patients alive. She walked past him before he could respond. The cardboard box felt heavier with every step. By the time she reached her car in the parking lot, it felt like she was carrying the entire weight of Helmand, all the casualties she couldn't save, all the procedures she'd performed in the dark while explosions lit the sky, all the veterans she'd watched die because they were 3 minutes too far from a hospital that existed only in her memory now. The drive to Richmond took 2 hours and 7 minutes. Megan knew because she watched the clock on her dashboard like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. Route 64 East. The sun rising behind her, turning the sky the color of old blood. She didn't turn on the radio. Didn't make any phone calls. Just drove in absolute silence while her hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing she could control anymore. The VA hospital in Richmond sat on a hill overlooking the city. It was smaller than Mercy General but older, with the particular exhaustion that comes from treating the consequences of every war America has fought since 1945. Megan sat in her car in the parking lot for 30 minutes before she could make herself go inside. 30 minutes of staring at her own reflection in the rearview mirror and not recognizing the person looking back. The waiting room was crowded at 0930 on a Thursday morning. A Marine in a wheelchair with prosthetics where his legs used to be. A woman with a scar running from her temple to her jawline, reading a magazine she wasn't actually looking at. An older man wearing a cap that said Afghanistan Vet 2009 to 2011 with hands that shook when he turned the page of his book. A veteran Megan recognized from Helmand, a sergeant she'd patched up after an IED blast in Sanjin Valley, sitting 3 seats away and not recognizing her because she was wearing civilian clothes and carrying a cardboard box instead of a medical kit. She was invisible here too. Just another broken thing waiting for someone to fix her. She took a number from the kiosk. 47. The electronic sign said they were serving number 31. The wait would be long. Megan found a clipboard with intake forms and began filling them out with a pen that had Mercy General Hospital printed on the side. Name: Megan Elizabeth O'Brien. Date of birth. Social Security number. Military service: United States Navy, active duty 2001 to 2015. Deployments: Helmand Province, Afghanistan, 2011 to 2014. She checked the box for service-related PTSD. The box for combat trauma. The box for occupational injury. The box for current suicidal ideation, no. That one was still accurate. Not yet. She sat back down among the veterans and waited for a therapist to call her number, to ask her questions she'd spent 14 years avoiding, to try to fix something that was already broken when she walked into this room. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Hayes was still alive, still in that ICU, still breathing because she'd done the one thing she wasn't supposed to do. And now she'd never get to see if he woke up. Never get to know if his daughter would get to keep her father. Never get to watch the thing she'd saved actually live. The waiting room was so quiet you could hear the clock on the wall tick away the seconds, and Megan O'Brien sat among the broken veterans of a dozen wars and waited for someone to tell her she wasn't broken too. 72 hours after Megan O'Brien walked out of Mercy General with her life in a cardboard box, a military helicopter landed on the hospital's rooftop without clearance, without warning, without asking permission. The rotors shook the windows on every floor. The intercom crackled with confused chatter from hospital security, but no one moved to stop what came next. For Navy SEALs in dress uniforms, dress blues with dress whites, anchors polished to mirror brightness, walked into the ICU like men on a classified mission. Their boots echoed on the tile in perfect unison. 1, 2, 3, 4. The lead SEAL was Master Chief Petty Officer James Graves, callsign Reaper, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. He stepped to the nursing desk and spoke in a voice that carried to every monitor in the unit, "We're looking for Senior Chief Megan O'Brien." "Where is she?" The charge nurse went pale. The ICU fell silent. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, but everything else stopped. Pens froze mid-chart, conversations died mid-sentence, a dropped medication cup rolled across the floor without anyone reaching for it. Hayes's daughter stood at the bedside with her hand still on her father's shoulder. She looked at the 4 uniformed SEALs, then at her father, then back at the men she didn't understand. "Senior Chief," she whispered. Her father's eyes opened. He tried to sit up. The monitor showed a cardiac pause, just for a moment, just long enough to register the shock. Master Chief Graves held a personnel file like a man holding classified evidence. His hands trembled as he opened it. Not from fear. From rage held in suspension, waiting for release. He began reading, not loudly, not shouting, but with the kind of quiet authority that fills a room like Pressure, Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. Every eye in the ICU locked on the file. Navy Cross. Another pause. The weight of each word settled like concrete. 3 purple hearts. He looked up at Hayes's daughter. Senior Chief Megan O'Brien treated over 300 combat casualties in Helmand Province before medical discharge for PTSD. She held more lives in her hands than any of you will ever see in a surgical career. He turned the file toward the assembled medical staff, nurses frozen in the hallway, residents staring from the pharmacy window, the hospital administrator who'd just arrived wondering what the hell was happening on his ICU floor. And someone terminated her for insubordination. For saving a Navy SEAL's life. For doing exactly what she's trained to do. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Somewhere in the depths of the building, Dr. Sterling was still on his lunch break, still believing his network held him safe, still rehearsing the story he'd tell. The nurse exceeded her scope, challenged his authority, forced his hand. He didn't know the truth was walking toward him with 4 SEALs carrying paperwork and something far more valuable, evidence. Marcus Webb appeared beside the hospital administrator like a ghost materializing from the walls. Marcus wasn't in the Navy anymore. He was a Marine Corps vet, ICU tech, the kind of quiet veteran who noticed everything and said nothing until it mattered. In his hands was a hard drive. Black. Unmarked. Lethal. I recovered this from the secure server, Marcus said, his voice steady as surgical steel. Dr. Sterling tried to delete it 47 minutes after Senior Chief O'Brien's termination. Didn't work. Encryption saved everything. He held it up. Every second of the pericardiocentesis. Every threat he made. Every moment she saved Lieutenant Commander Hayes while he stood in that doorway telling her she'd never practice nursing again. Master Chief Graves turned to the hospital administrator. I need this played. Right now. On every screen that matters. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The administrator nodded without speaking and gestured toward the nearest conference room. Within 90 seconds, the footage was loading on a 70-inch screen that had never shown anything more important than an advertisement for the new orthopedic wing. Dr. Sterling walked back from the cafeteria at 1,305 hours, balancing a salad and a coffee, still convinced his position was unshakable. The hospital board called him into a closed conference room at 13:08. He walked in expecting routine business. He walked into his own destruction. The screen showed Megan, steady as a surgeon, moving through the pericardiocentesis with hands that had held lives in combat zones. It showed Sterling's face as he threatened her license. It showed the timestamp, 2:17 a.m., when he was supposed to be sleeping, supposedly unreachable. Instead, he was making calls, contacting board members, constructing a termination narrative that would hold up in court. His face went white. Not red. Not defensive. White, like all the blood had drained into the floor below him. His shoulders collapsed inward, the posture of a man watching his institutional power evaporate in real time. The procedure was outside her scope, he started, words tumbling out like a man drowning. She had no authority. I was protecting the hospital from. You were protecting statistics, Master Chief Graves said, and the words cut like a scalpel. While a Navy SEAL died. While a decorated officer suffered in a bed 2 floors below your office. While the only person in this hospital with actual combat medical training performed emergency intervention because 10 doctors were too afraid of liability to act. Sterling's hand started moving, defensive gestures, palms up, the physical language of collapse. The procedure was experimental, the patient was unstable, the risks of death were 100% without it, Graves said. You've got 3 seconds to stop talking and listen. Sterling stopped. The administrator opened his laptop. The footage played. 2 minutes of unedited video showing Megan drawing blood from Hayes's pericardium, showing the monitor climbing, showing sinus rhythm stabilizing, showing a Navy SEAL's daughter crying in relief while her father's chest rose and fell with breaths he wouldn't have taken without Senior Chief O'Brien. The timestamp at the bottom right read 2:17 a.m. Sterling's deletion request, captured in the hospital's security logs, came at 2:13 a.m. 30 minutes. That's what he'd spent trying to erase evidence of her heroism. The administrator's jaw tightened like a steel door closing. "Dr. Sterling, you're suspended pending investigation. Leave the building within the hour. Security will escort you to your office and then to the parking lot. Do not attempt to access hospital systems or communicate with any staff member." It wasn't negotiation. It was termination with a 45-minute grace period. Sterling stood up and left without another word. What happened next unfolded like a controlled demolition. The board members he'd called during his conspiracy against Megan started returning calls to the hospital administrator instead, distancing themselves with comments like, "I was unaware of the full situation and the doctor misrepresented the case to me." The nursing school references he'd contacted sent emails to the hospital clarifying that they'd told him directly, that Megan had classified military experience we couldn't discuss in detail, which he'd omitted from his termination report. The external investigator he'd brought in to build the case against her reviewed Marcus Webb's footage and submitted a preliminary report recommending criminal charges for evidence tampering and obstruction. By Friday, Sterling's medical license was under state review. By Monday, Mercy General's board demanded his resignation to avoid a lawsuit from Hayes's family that would have cost them 7 figures in legal fees before it even went to trial. The hospital attorney found Sterling in his office at 5 p.m., packing diplomas that would never hang in another hospital. "Doctor," the attorney said quietly, "if you resign immediately, we won't pursue charges. If you fight this, the Navy's JAG office has indicated they'll investigate whether you violated federal law by interfering with the care of an active duty service member." Sterling signed the resignation with hands that couldn't stop shaking. No fight. No appeal. Just exit. 2 months later, a process server found him at the Hampton Commons shopping center, in the booth beside a cell phone kiosk, selling supplemental health insurance policies to customers who needed cell phones far more than they needed additional medical coverage. He wore a polo shirt with a company logo. No stethoscope. No white coat. No authority. No staff. No power. Just a man on commission, eating another day without the title that had defined him, watching people pass his folding table and never knowing he'd once controlled 10 doctors and a surgical department. They walked right past him. Nobody recognized him. Nobody cared who he'd been. 6 months after the helicopter landing, Megan O'Brien stood in dress uniform for the first time in 3 years. Senior Chief Petty Officer's anchors gleamed on her shoulder boards, not the worn combat insignia she'd carried hidden under scrubs, but the official rank, the public authority, the recognition that had finally been named aloud. The lobby of Portsmouth Naval Medical Center stretched around her like a cathedral, and she was standing in it in full dress blues, waiting for her first training session to begin. Young sailors and corpsmen filed into the classroom, 23 of them, all combat medics or emergency medical technicians learning the procedures that save lives in the seconds before a helicopter can arrive. They looked at her and saw the uniform first. Then they saw the eyes. The eyes that had seen things. The eyes that had done things. The eyes that didn't look away. On her office shelf sat a pair of combat boots. Polished to mirror brightness. Identical to the one she'd discarded at Mercy General, the one security had thrown away with her career. This pair had been presented at her reinstatement ceremony by the SEAL team that carried her to Norfolk in the first place. Beside them stood a plaque, engraved in letters that caught the light, for the one who stayed. Hayes had stood at attention during the presentation despite his surgeon's explicit orders for bed rest. His daughter had read a letter Megan had written to her son during his first deployment, a letter she didn't even remember writing, words sent to a child she thought might not come home. "Your CO is the best man I've served with. Keep him alive, and he'll keep you alive." Her son, now a lieutenant junior grade, appeared in her office doorway in camouflage utilities at 1,630 hours. "Mom, you ready? Commander Hayes wants to buy you lunch." Megan picked up her cover, adjusted it in the mirror, and saw not the trembling civilian nurse who hid for 3 years. She saw the senior chief who never really left. The voice came out steady, measured, commanding, "Tell him 1,900 hours." I need to finish briefing these sailors on femoral artery ligation first." Her son smiled. That was the voice he remembered. That was the mother who taught him how to stay alive. Back at Mercy General, the ICU had changed. The hospital had implemented a new hiring policy. Veteran nurses were now asked about prior service during orientation, and those with combat experience were prioritized for trauma cases. Hayes's daughter worked there as a volunteer on weekends, telling anyone who'd listen about the nurse who saved her father when 10 doctors walked away. The disciplinary board where Megan's name had been written in red marker now displayed a bronze plaque, the Bryan ICU, dedicated to SCPO Megan O'Brien, USN, RET, who exemplified the highest standards of nursing excellence and courage under pressure. And in the break room where four nurses once abandoned Megan to eat alone, staff gathered for monthly meetings led by Marcus Webb, now the hospital's official veteran liaison, who told every new hire, sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Sometimes they're standing right next to you in the break room, and if you're not careful, you'll miss them. Subscribe, and I'll show you more stories of heroes you almost never knew existed. Like this video if Megan's story reminded you that strength isn't always loud. And tell me, what would you have done if you'd known who she really was?